Welcome to today's webinar, everybody. We are so glad that you can join us. I know many of you are listening in from afar, which is why we provide these free webinars. Parents and professionals alike can register for any of our free online events and have access to evidence-based updates explained by highly qualified expert presenters. We host multiple webinars each month, so please visit our website at autism.org to view the schedule. We also continually add webinars, so if you're not on our email list, you can visit autism.org and click subscribe on the homepage to receive regular updates. To get instant news and events from ARI, you may also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. ARI also publishes an award-winning quarterly journal, the Autism Research Review International, or ARRI. The ARRI Quarterly Journal helps you stay up to date with the latest research on autism and is freely available online at arrionline.org. This webinar will be recorded and playback will be available later today at autism.org/webinars. No continuing education credits are provided for this talk, but free certificates of participation are available upon successful completion of a brief knowledge quiz following the webinar. And that link will be on the webinar page approximately 2 hours following the talk. These webinars are made possible by generous donor support, and you can visit autism.org to donate to support this work. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker for today's talk on assessment and treatment of severe and dangerous behaviors. Dr. Nathan Call received his doctorate in school psychology from the University of Iowa in 2003. He's been at Marcus Autism Center since 2006, where he has held many positions as a clinician and a leader of treatment programs. Dr. Call, I will give you the floor and take it away.
Thank you very much, Megan, and thank you to ARI for putting this series together. I find it so important that we disseminate information and share information around what are considered best practices and new developments in the field. There's such a need for that type of work, and so I'm very grateful for ARI's efforts in that perspective. Just a few quick notes before I dive into the actual content. First of all, I think it's important to note that many of my comments were intended to reach an audience at about the level of a caregiver, as opposed to this is not necessarily going to be the most complicated and latest and greatest research outcomes that are difficult to consume. My intent is to make this as consumable as possible, and so that's the level of the audience that I'm hoping to speak to today, and I hope that this resonates with those of you who are caregivers or parents or therapists or individuals who are working with individuals on the spectrum. Another thing I want to say is that I work in a department of pediatrics, and so you'll hear me give lots of examples. And even just as I speak, it's very natural for me to refer to kids and children and that type of thing when I'm referring to examples. But nothing that I'm going to present today is unique to children necessarily. The techniques, the strategies, and so forth apply regardless of the age of the individual. In my own history as a professional, I've worked with kids as young as 12 months all the way up to 92 years of age. So there certainly is more generality to that. It's just very much a habit for me that when I'm speaking, I tend to refer to kids and children. And so I apologize, and I hope that doesn't throw anybody off or make them feel like what I'm going to be talking about they can't relate to that. And then lastly, because of those two things, oftentimes I'm talking to groups of parents and caregivers. One of the things I'm eager to have an opportunity to try to do some Q&A at the end of this, time permitting. But one of the types of questions that can tend to be really difficult and in some cases even inappropriate to try to answer are really specific questions around an individual and the needs of an individual. It's tough to try to answer those questions in a short span of time like this and without the kinds of detail that are often required in order to give real medical advice. And so I will try my best to refrain from that, or maybe provide more general answers if those kinds of questions come up. At the same time, I work with parents, I work with individuals who are trying to address some of these issues, and so I completely understand the need for the kind of information, the kind of answers that many people are looking for. And so I want to try to do what I can to try to be helpful, but we'll really refrain from answering really specific questions about individual sets of needs in this particular type of forum. So I'll get started then and kind of talk about what exactly are we is the topic for today, right? And what I'm going to really refer to are just that there are lots of different forms of behavior that put individuals at risk for one or more types of harm. And that kind of harm can be pretty varied across the individual and the circumstances. But just to give a couple of examples of the type of behavior I'm talking about, this can include things like aggression, hitting, kicking, biting, scratching, pinching, headbutting, right? All of these would be examples of aggression, self-injury, self-biting, head banging, head hitting. I've worked with individuals who jump up in the air and land on their knees in ways that are harmful to their joints. Lots of different forms of self-injurious behavior. Skin picking is another that we see with some regularity, eye gouging, what have you. Property destruction, where destroying property through as a part of tantrums or in other ways that are going to limit access to opportunities outside of the home or even inside the home. Elopement is a term that is sometimes not well understood. I was presenting at a conference many years ago on interventions for elopement, and I remember people coming up to me and saying, "I didn't realize that kids with autism will run away to Vegas getting married," and we had to explain, no, elopement just means leaving supervision without permission, and that is a really big issue for individuals on the spectrum. It's the leading contributor to the fact that kids with autism have double the premature death rate of their neurotypical peers, and there are really some tragic outcomes resulting from kids wandering or running away from supervision. Tantrums are another. Pica is one where individuals may consume inedible objects. And I have a really interesting collection of x-rays of things that have had to be removed from people that I was working with because it was so life-threatening. And so each of these different types of behavior, I'm going to try to introduce terms as I go, not because there's a quiz later, but mostly because for me, it's hard to sometimes just speak off the cuff like this without just using terms that have become very ingrained for me. And so I want to give you these definitions now so that if I accidentally use those terms later, you'll know what I'm talking about. So each of these, though, are referred to a different topography. Topography really just means the form of the behavior. So aggression is kind of a class of behavior or a group of behaviors that we would call the topography. But even within aggression, there are many different topographies of aggression, like hitting, kicking, biting, scratching, headbutting, hair pulling, all those types of things. So I'll try to define this as I go and not necessarily rely heavily on jargon. But if I do use the term topography, now you know what it means, and hopefully it's something that can stick. All right, so that's really kind of the class of behavior that we're going to be talking about today, and really defining it based on its impact on the individual, has the potential to cause harm. There's lots of different terms that have been used, and there is a little bit of a debate that's been going on over the last handful of years around what we call this. And so, again, before I get into this too far, I want to give a rationale for why I'm going to be using some of the terms that I will. So the term severe behavior used to be used a lot. Problem behavior was sometimes used to refer to this type of behavior. As people have kind of become a little more understanding of how stigma is associated with individuals who exhibit these kinds of behavior, those terms have really fallen out of favor, and understandably so. Increasingly, people have started to use the term challenging behavior. But again, people who are on the autism spectrum or care for individuals who are on the autism spectrum have kind of noted that when we use that term challenging behavior, we're not really being very clear about what we mean. And who's being challenged by that behavior? Is the behavior challenging for the individual who exhibits the behavior, or is it more challenging for the people around them? And if so, whose priorities are we trying to address? That's an issue that sometimes makes that term a little bit confusing. So, like I said, there's problems with just about every term that's been used. And I don't know that we have a perfect solution for this at this point. I think there is a desire to try to be understanding, to describe this as clearly as we can so that it's clear what we're talking about, while also trying to minimize things like stigma, minimize things like ableism and so forth. And so I don't know that we've got it figured out. I don't know that we have it exactly right at this point, but some colleagues and I recently were dealing with this, and what we eventually landed on is what we care about most is that these are all different behaviors that compromise the safety of the individual or those around them. And so going with this term, safety compromising behavior, which is a mouthful, so you may be using the acronym SCB, or safety compromising behavior, is kind of where, at least in the latest set of conversations I've had, some colleagues and I have landed. I don't think we're perfect at this point yet. I think we would love to have something a little more concise, but that's the term I'm going to try to use today. And if people have better ideas for me as we go through this, please share it in the chat, because again, I don't think we've got this nailed yet, and I think there's still more work to do to make sure we're using the right terms in ways that meet all the needs of everyone involved. So I want to talk a little bit then about the impact of SCBs, or safety compromising behavior. They can have a lot of really negative consequences. If you're looking at my screen right now, on a screen that's big enough to really see, there's an example of a young man that I worked with a while back who would bite at his arm, and you can see his arm is in really rough shape, right? This is a young man who had caused permanent scarring, lots of open wounds and lesions as a result of biting, which has huge implications for his lifelong health and quality of life. Super high risk for things like infections as a result of this type of behavior, scarring. It was just really something that was very, very harmful to him in a very direct physical injury type of a way. But there are other less direct impacts of some of these behaviors, both in terms of how it might affect the individual and those that they care for. This type of behavior frequently interferes with the ability to do things like learn new skills. Individuals who engage in safety compromising behavior can't always be in the same kinds of settings. And that may have an impact on things like learning. If they can't be in a classroom that they might otherwise be able to learn from because of this behavior, that can limit their ability to acquire new skills. It can limit their opportunities to engage and interact with other people. It can limit their opportunity to have leisure activities that they prefer. So there's really big restrictions that come from this type of behavior. And that includes for the individuals that care for them. So those individuals who care for them may not be able to have the same kind of quality of life because they aren't able to go to certain places while they're caring for this individual. They may not be able to go to the movie theater or the grocery store or church. That this behavior can be very, very limiting. It can disrupt household routines. It does frequently cause contact with law enforcement, which is its own set of risks. And there are some really tragic examples of bad outcomes and tragic outcomes that have come from engaging with law enforcement or other first responders who are responding to what they think is a crisis that needs a certain kind of management, and rather than de-escalating, things get escalated, and things can really go from there in a way that is tragic. And then family stress. I mentioned disruption of household routines. Families that I work with oftentimes get in a situation where they have very limited networks of support because their world essentially has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And I still, there's one family that kind of exemplifies this for me more than any other. And I remember working with the family when they started our intervention at our center. And I remember asking this mom how she was doing, and she said, "Well, things aren't great." I said, and she said, "We're getting by." I said, "Well, tell me what getting by looks like for you." And she said, "Well, when our son gets upset, we take our two little girls in the back bedroom, we barricade ourselves inside with some heavy furniture, and it's usually 45 minutes to an hour before we can come out and look at how many holes there are in the wall, because we need to know if we're going to go over our drywall budget for the month. And all the windows are screwed shut and they have plexiglass over them. We keep our appliances in the garage. We cook our meals out there because he destroyed our washer dryer, and we know that he could destroy other appliances. We actually use the laundry room for our girls to play in. We lock because it's got a lock on it, and we can lock them in there with the toys. Eat our meals off of paper plates, don't have a lot of other real furniture in the house, don't really leave the house for much other than just my husband to go to work. We have two deadbolts on the door. One key is around my neck, the other key is around my husband's neck. And the reason for that is if he knocks one of us unconscious, we know that he'll get the key, because the last time he got one key and we only had one deadbolt, and it was 24 hours before the cops found him in the woods with no clothes on. But we're getting by, right? And first of all, just the resilience for that family to feel like they were getting by when most of us, if we were to just be transplanted into that household, would be in a state of crisis, I think says something about how different families have different capabilities of manage these types of stressors. And then the other thing I think it says about this type of a situation is that many of the families that we work with, because of those kinds of circumstances, are very isolated. And one of the first things that I try to do when I work with families like that is provide a little bit of validation. These are not necessarily families that are out, like I said, going to church, going to the grocery store, going to the movie theater, and they're not always seen and heard and listened to, because there are a lot of people who just don't think this really happens in our country in this day and age. And I'm here to tell you, and I think if you're on this call or if you're on this webinar, I think you probably are aware that this kind of situation can come up. It happens more than people think, and these families deserve help and support that they really, truly need. And so that's really what I'm going to try to spend a little bit of time talking about today. All right, so I want to talk about especially behavioral interventions for safety compromising behavior. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on psychopharmacology. Really, I'm not going to spend any time on psychopharmacology, although that is considered a frontline treatment. Most of the individuals I work with have had multiple trials of medications to try to address safety compromising behavior, and it hasn't had the intended effect or to the degree that the family is looking for that individual. And so really at that point, we're really left with working on behavioral interventions and approaches. And I'm going to start by talking about just giving a vignette of a hypothetical kid. I love hypothetical kids because they always do exactly what I tell them to, and they make for great examples. And so, but I hope this is a little bit instructive. So I'm calling this kid Tim. And let's just say Tim is on the autism spectrum, and Tim, he has some different topographies of safety compromising behavior. He sometimes hits, he sometimes screams and tantrums. Sometimes he hits and screams when his parents tell him to turn off the television. Sometimes he screams and hits when they tell him he has to brush his teeth. I don't think we're talking about anything too wild and crazy at this point. I think most of you, if you're again on this webinar, you know that this is not a way outlandish example of what may happen. It's maybe oversimplified, but hopefully it'll make the point as I work through some thoughts around how we might approach helping Tim and his family out. So there's a couple of different approaches to how one goes about trying to address safety compromising behavior. And traditionally and historically, the approach that I would describe is what would sometimes be called topographically prescribed treatments. And if I were to make an equation, it would look a little bit like this. So safety compromising behavior X equals strategy Y, right? So whatever behavioral strategy you're supposed to try should be based on the topography of that behavior. An example of that would be something like, if the individual bites, then you follow through with timeout. If the child hits, hitting should result in, I don't know, a punisher or some other consequence. And basing the specific strategy on the topography of the behavior. I find that this is really common advice that people get that takes a form like this, where maybe you're at a family reunion and your child acts up, and then you get a provider or you get a caregiver or a family member who gives you lots of advice about, well, tantrums should result in a spanking, or tantrums should result in timeout. I live here in the Southeast United States, and when I first moved here, the example of this that I heard was for biting specifically, and it was whenever a young child, especially, bites, the approach was supposed to be that you should bite them back for some reason, which I always found a little bit curious why we're biting young kids. But that was something that people would oftentimes recommend. And that's an example of a topography-based strategy, because the strategy, in this case, biting or timeout, is based on the topography of the safety compromising behavior that you're trying to address. All right, so let's think about this idea. Let's say there's in the case of Tim, a topographically prescribed treatment might be something like hitting equals timeout, right? Whenever Tim hits, he's supposed to go to timeout. So in the first case, when Tim hits his parents after they turn off the television, he goes to timeout. And if he hits while he's supposed to be brushing his teeth, he goes to timeout, right? Because hitting equals timeout in this approach. Now, it's critically important, and that if there's anything you take away from anything I say here today, the overall point that I would love for people to take away is how important it is to try to think about these types of things from the perspective of the individual or child, right? So if we think about this from Tim's perspective, and again, oversimplification, but if we were to have Tim be able to articulate how he was experiencing this, he might say, well, when I hit, not only do I not get to go watch TV, I have to go sit on the steps. In this case, he's sitting on the steps in timeout, so I don't get to do anything that I like. That kind of sucks. And over time, you would expect Tim to learn hitting is actually counterproductive, that it results in less access to television, less access to fun things. Hitting is not a great outcome, does not produce a great outcome, so do less of it, right? You would learn that that's not going to be very effective. Now let's think about this with brushing his teeth, right? Parents say, go brush your teeth, Tim. He hits. They're following this topographically prescribed approach where they would say, well, he hit, he should go back to the steps and sit in timeout. And from Tim's perspective, what does that mean? Well, when I hit, I don't have to brush my teeth. That's kind of what I'm looking for. So this is a really good outcome for Tim. And this just highlights the problem with this topographically prescribed approach to treatment, which is sometimes it's going to be effective, sometimes it's not. And when I talk to families about what strategies have they tried and whether or not they're working, what I tend to hear a lot is, well, sometimes it works, but sometimes not. And it's really inconsistent. And this is oftentimes the biggest reason why, is because the strategies that are being tried are being based on the form of the behavior, not necessarily the purpose that the behavior serves for that individual. And we talk about purpose, the term that we were using here is the function. The function is why the behavior occurs from the perspective of the child or the individual, right? What is it they're trying to get out of that behavior? And so the alternative to a topography-based approach is a function-based approach. And here's that equation that I had earlier, rewritten for a function-based approach, where we would say safety compromised behavior maintained by consequence X equals strategy Y. But it also could mean safety compromising behavior maintained by consequence A is resulting in strategy B, and so on and so forth. So this might look like biting or hitting maintained by attention equals ignoring, whereas any examples that are of hitting or biting that are maintained by escaping from a demand result in something else like following through. And the reason why this is so important of a differentiation is that this approach allows for a lot of individualization to that individual, and there's a lot of evidence in research showing that these approaches are more effective. So let's go back to Tim then and talk about, well, what does this mean for Tim? If we were to use that function-based approach, hitting maintained by access to preferred activities like television should equal timeout. Hitting maintained by escape from demands like brushing teeth should actually result in following through with that demand. So in the case of he hits whenever they tell him to turn off the TV, same outcome from Tim's perspective. I hit, I don't get to watch TV, that sucks. Over time, he's going to learn that that's not very effective. Alternatively, he's asked to brush his teeth, he hits, and now they say, well, not only do you have to brush your teeth, maybe we accelerate the rate of brushing teeth, and we're going to make sure you do it, and we're going to prompt through it and make sure that there's no opportunity to escape. And in this instance, Tim's going to learn, when I hit, still have to brush my teeth. It's not very effective. And over time, he might learn to have a different outcome through other means. And I'll get into more detail about what that would look like. Again, super oversimplified, but hopefully makes my point about why function is really important. Now, when we talk about function, there are a couple of different ways to describe, or different categories of function. The biggest category would be those behaviors that we would describe as socially mediated. These are functions where the purpose is essentially to get an outcome where someone else is involved. In the chain of events that lead from the safety compromising behavior to the outcome that's driving that behavior or maintain that behavior, there's another person somewhere involved in that chain. So a cookie can be a socially mediated outcome if it's on the top shelf and Tim needs mom to get it for him, right? Because mom is involved in getting or providing that cookie. Mom giveth, mom taketh away, mom presents time to brush your teeth, mom can ask you to turn off the television. All examples of socially mediated functions, access to preferred items, access to attention, and so on. It's maybe easiest to understand this by looking at the contrasting category, which would be automatically maintained behavior, which is just that there is no one else involved in that chain of consequences, right? So a behavior occurs and the consequence that maintains it, and there's no one else interceding or intervening in that process. These are oftentimes thought of as stimulatory type behavior. These are behaviors that automatically produce their own consequence. And so things like self-injury, for example, sometimes that can actually be socially mediated. An individual has learned that if someone restricts something that I really like and I hit myself, someone will come back and say, here, take the iPad, please calm down, as a way to soothe or appease that individual. That's an example of a socially mediated form of self-injury. But self-injury can also be automatically maintained. Some individuals hit themselves in the head, perhaps because it produces some form of stimulation that they find rewarding, or that it attenuates something they don't like in the environment. And that, as a result, can be just automatically producing that consequence. This is a really important distinction because the approaches for these two different types of functions look really, really different. Examples of common social functions. I mentioned escaping from tasks or other things that might be going on in the environment that are overly stimulating. Access to preferred items or activities, attention from other people. Avoidance of social situations is one that we see a lot with individuals on the autism spectrum. Avoidance of attention from other people. Whereas for automatically maintained behavior, again, these are oftentimes more sensory stimulation or things that are happening to compete with or block out sensory stimulation that might be aversive. Now, how does one go about actually figuring out the function of an individual's safety compromising behavior? Well, first of all, there are lots of different ways to go about doing this. Some of them are very, very formal, some of them less so. The process, though, is called functional assessment, and it's really a functional assessment is any approach to identifying the function of safety compromising behavior. Most of these require some training to actually conduct and evaluate. They're not all, and some of them, as I said, are very complicated and require a lot of training and experience. Those types of approaches are oftentimes, I'm going to tell you, as a place that does a lot of those very comprehensive types, gold standard evaluations or functional assessments, those types of approaches are really not always necessary, and that there are less intensive, less rigorous forms that are oftentimes adequate for identifying what the function of the behavior is, and oftentimes attempting different strategies based on some assumptions about our hypotheses about function, and then look to see, is that having the desired outcome or not? is itself a form of assessment and analysis. So within functional assessment, I think the simplest is to just kind of ask yourself some questions and see if all of the answers are pointing in the same direction. Questions like, does this behavior happen more frequently in certain times or places or settings? And if so, what's going on in those situations? Well, it's always happening on the playground. All right, well, what goes on the playground? Well, there's other kids who are playing with equipment that this kid really likes. Oh, well, that means maybe this is about access to preferred items or activities. One of the questions I ask a lot, what would happen if we restricted access to the child's most preferred thing, or restricted attention, or presented a demand? Oftentimes with caregivers, I hear them say like, wait a minute, what? You're not going to do that, are you? Because I definitely don't want to see that. Um, what is the individual trying to say, especially for that socially mediated behavior? That is a form of communication. The individual is saying, I would really like it if I could have a cookie right now. They oftentimes just lack the means to communicate that effectively through other means. Are there times and situations when the behavior doesn't occur, right? When they have access to that really preferred thing, when they've got the iPad, we never see the behavior. It's just when we take it away that we see that problem. Oh, okay. Again, giving some hints and clues. It always happens it never happens when we're playing together, but when I've got to cook a meal, that's when we see the behavior. Okay. That's telling us a lot about what the function might be. And then again, what's the one thing you could do to guarantee the behavior to occur? That would be an example of a question that can oftentimes give a lot of insight. So this is just a really unstructured set of questions that could give insights and help develop some of those hypotheses. This is what I would consider to be kind of the lowest intensity, lowest rigor, lowest consistent approach, consistency or high fidelity approach to determining function, but it's also the most accessible. And then contrast that with what I would consider to be the opposite end of that spectrum, which would be functional analysis. And in a functional analysis, what happens is we intentionally set up different types of conditions that systematically manipulate the environment in ways that might allow us to see the behavior and when it occurs and when it doesn't. What functional analysis is really, really good for is separating out all of the different situations that can occur and isolating those variables to assess what might be contributing to the occurrence of the safety compromising behavior. So for example, you go to the grocery store and it's really hard to figure out if a tantrum occurs or if aggression occurs. Is it because it's too loud or too crowded, or we walked past the candy aisle, or there were balloons somewhere, or whatever, right? Like all these things are happening at once. So it's really hard to figure out which of those things may have contributed to that specific episode of safety compromising behavior. And so what a functional analysis will do is to tease those different things apart by testing them one at a time. It's almost like the behavioral equivalent of an allergy test, where they prick your skin with 50 different things and then they look to see where there's a reaction. That's almost what's happening with this, only in this case, we're testing that out in different conditions. And so within this graph, what you can see is there are these different dots or symbols. In this case, the ones that are highlighted are blue squares. Again, depending on how big your screen is, they may or may not look like squares. But each one of these different symbols represents a different set of circumstances, or what we call a condition. And these are supposed to be analogous to those real world scenarios that occur all the time, but isolating those specific situations. And so the one that's highlighted in blue right now is what we would call a tangible condition. And what that refers to is we're testing the hypothesis that restricting access to a preferred tangible item or activity is invoking and then gaining access to that is maintaining the behavior of interest. This was a young man who engaged in aggressive and disruptive behavior. And what you can see is that a therapist would essentially say, here, have this preferred activity. And then a couple minutes in would walk over and say, you know what, we got to put that away. I think it was an iPad, right? We got to put the iPad away right now. And then if the individual became aggressive or disruptive, they would say, never mind. No, forget it. You can keep it for another 30 seconds. And then they would go back to try to restrict it again. And then what we're doing is we're looking to see how much of that aggressive and disruptive behavior occurs in this condition relative to other conditions. And you can see by the fact that these blue squares are all relatively and consistently elevated that we're seeing a good amount of that aggressive and disruptive behavior for this individual in this particular condition. So telling us there's something going on here around accessing restricted items. Contrast that with a condition where we might present demands to see if escaping from non-preferred demands are actually maintaining the behavior. And so in this condition, a therapist would say, here's a task to do. There's actually two different data paths here. One was a self-care task. One was a more academic task. And in both instances, they would say it's time to do a little bit of work. And if the aggressive and disruptive behavior occurred, then they'd say, never mind, take a break for 30 seconds. And then after those 30 seconds, go back to representing the task. And what we're seeing in this instance is, again, we're seeing a good amount of aggressive and disruptive behavior anytime those tasks were presented, suggesting that the behavior is potentially also maintained by escaping from those non-preferred tasks. And then we contrast that with our control condition. It's a little bit hard to see here, but those bolded circles that are white, that are all along the bottom axis there, are the condition where really we're trying to make sure that everything is going okay in that kid's environment. So they have free access to the iPad. We're not presenting with any demands. They're getting lots of attention. So there shouldn't be a real reason in terms of external events to engage in that aggressive and disruptive behavior. And sure enough, that's what happened. If you look at those bold circles, they're all in that 0 range where we're not seeing any aggressive or disruptive behavior from this young man. And that comparison of, all right, how does this individual look in terms of safety compromising behavior when they're in this toy play or control condition versus these other test conditions tells us whether or not the behavior serves that function. And for this young man, because it's low in the control and high in everything else, we're concluding that his behavior is maintained by access to preferred items and escape from demands. And that then gives us some clues about what strategies are going to be more effective. Now, the question then becomes, all right, well, I know the function, now what? So I'm not going to get into a ton of detail. I'm not going to walk you through the specifics of every aspect, but I do want to really talk about, from our standpoint at the center where I work, we've done some work on really thinking about what are the different elements of a treatment plan that are necessary. And the truth is, depending on whether you're doing this at home and it's kind of a home cooked type of an approach, or you're working with a professional, different folks are going to have different perspectives on this and different areas of emphasis. But really, in a nutshell, I think the 4 elements would be, first of all, prevention. These are things that you can do to make sure that the behavior never occurs in the first place. Then there's behavioral interventions. And so I'm a BCBA and a psychologist, but the BCBA in me, this is really where there's a lot of expertise that's been developed over many, many years. These are procedures that are over time going to decrease the probability of that behavior happening through learning. So learning alternative approaches and communication, or learning that in Tim's case, hitting doesn't get you access to the TV. Those are strategies that over time and over the long run can reduce that behavior from occurring. But there's also the need for things like behavior management strategies, which is while you're working on that behavioral intervention, some behavior is going to occur. Or even when the behavioral intervention is at optimal effectiveness, that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting to 100% reduction all the time in every situation. So behavior management strategies, or sometimes mitigation strategies, are those strategies that are going to lessen the effects of the behavior, things that are going to make it safe to go out in the community, things that are going to make it so that we can continue to work on learning new skills if that behavior occurs without necessarily those kinds of disruptions. And then lastly, it's really important to have crisis management strategies. And so I want to say that, these are all different important parts of a treatment plan. The BCBA in me, I think there's a real emphasis on behavioral interventions, but I haven't seen enough work on how all of these 4 parts need to work together and how all critically important all 4 pieces are. I think a lot of folks who may be able to work with the BCBA, who has experience in working with safety compromising behavior, they may only get that behavioral intervention piece. And if you're not including all 4 elements, there's really something missing from that treatment plan, because that means that there's pieces that are critically important to quality of life and the ability to move through your day while that behavioral intervention is still being put in place. So just talking briefly about prevention, I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing that I'm probably not moving fast enough. I know you're thinking that I talk really, really fast, and yet here I am, and I'm thinking I need to move a little bit faster to get through some of this material and make sure there's time for questions. But prevention really means taking steps to avoid the behavior. There's 3 different approaches: making the behavior more difficult or even impossible, decreasing the motivation to engage in it in the first place, and providing signals or cues. In terms of making the dangerous behavior impossible, this can be really environmental engineering. It's simple stuff oftentimes. Things like, if you don't want something thrown at your head, lock it away and make sure it's not accessible. If you don't want, that's one of the rules of the thumb that I live by. Anything you hand to a kid might come flying back at you. So make sure you're thoughtful about what is in the environment. Another would be things like decreasing motivation. There's different ways to do this. One is to just provide continuous access. So if the behavior is maintained by access to the iPad, one way to reduce the behavior is to provide access to the iPad. If the kid's got the iPad, there's really no reason to engage in safety compromising behavior maintained by access to an iPad. Now, again, some real limitations. I'm not telling folks that prevention is the way to go all the time, but when you're in a situation where maybe the behavior would be super dangerous or disruptive in ways that are going to affect quality of life, this is one of the tools you want to have in your arsenal so that you can at least pull this out when you need it to make a dangerous situation safe or to get through something that might be really important, but otherwise is going to be very, very difficult or impossible. I can think about the example of the young girl who we worked with, wasn't that young, she was maybe 10 or 11, and she would get really, really aggressive, including when driving in the car at freeway speeds, a super dangerous kind of behavior. Now, we knew that for her, a lot of time this was access to a really preferred thing, which was gospel music. And so this is not one of those situations where BCBA says never, ever give in and play gospel music when there's aggression. This might be one of those things where when you get in the car and you're going someplace and you're going to be on the freeway, start the music and play it on loop. Just avoid the situation because we're trying to get to from A to B in a safe way, as opposed to wait for the behavior to occur, then turn it on and actually reinforce that behavior that you're trying to reduce. So this is an important tool to have in the arsenal. Now, you probably spotted the real issue here, which is you can overly rely on prevention. And when I work with families, oftentimes prevention strategies are the ones they've landed on all by themselves. They've figured out how to avoid the behavior at whatever cost. They've figured out, look, give them access to the iPad. Saw a family not that long ago who walked into our center and they had the young man had 13 iPads with him pretty much at all times. And I watched him bend an iPad in half with his bare hands, which was not a thing that I knew you could do. They had to sneak into his room at night to charge them because if anybody tried to touch or fiddle with them, he got really aggressive. And so they had figured out that iPads were one of the ways to try to prevent this type of behavior, this safety compromising behavior through continuous access. But it really didn't allow for much else to happen in his world. So I would describe one set of strategies as accommodation, like providing as frequent access as you possibly can. And the alternative is to really focus more on, look, we're going to focus on working through some of the safety compromising behavior, even if the individual is upset some of the time. And so that means, in the case of accommodation, this young man, he was mostly happy most of the time. If the iPad batteries died or there wasn't Wi-Fi, things got real, real fast. But, at least some of the time, he was a pretty happy dude. As opposed to if we were going to try to teach him, look, you can't have the iPad all the time, he would get really agitated. He would become dangerous in some cases. And so the family really was pretty heavily reliant on that prevention approach. Now, again, I think these are reasonable approaches. It's not as though prevention is bad, but if you rely exclusively on that and then you're expecting the outcomes of more of an integrative approach, then that's when things get a little bit mismatched and can really be problematic. All right, I want to talk about intervention. And again, I've talked about this a little bit already, but these are those strategies that lower the probability of the behavior happening in the first place. This is where long-term improvements happen, but it's also the slowest approach. And so oftentimes these are strategies that are based on teaching alternative approaches to accessing the functional consequence. So if the young man's behavior is maintained by access to the iPad, teaching him to ask for the iPad and then wait for the iPad if it isn't available right now, those would be examples of skills that can be taught to reduce the safety compromising behavior. And the specifics of what that intervention looks like really is tied to the function of the behavior. So escape behavior might be teaching tolerance to tasks slowly and over time, or teaching the individual to request breaks, whereas behavior maintained by attention is going to look entirely different. It really depends on the function of the behavior. So again, the implications of using these type of approaches is that they take a while. Caregivers generally have to be the ones to implement them at least some of the time. They can be really, really high effort, and the behavior can reemerge as the situation changes, as new challenges are introduced or new situations come up. So it's really important to stay vigilant. So all that's to say, this is high effort, high energy, high complexity, but has the greatest long-term outcomes. And that's just a reality that has to be balanced against other strategies in terms of what is it that can be accomplished in the near term, what are the priorities of the family and the individual, and how does this fit into that overall constellation of approaches within that overall treatment plan. One of the things that's really, really key that I talk to with families about when talking about these behavioral interventions is that a lot of the time it's really important to take a step back in other areas that are being worked on. Now, I remember talking to a teacher who went into the classroom and there was a young man who was running around the classroom and he was ripping papers off the wall, tearing up things that was other kids' desks, throwing items all the time, didn't ever really sit in his chair. And we kind of said, all right, what is he supposed to be working on? Well, he's supposed to be sitting in his chair and doing like simple, I think, counting exercises, right? And so we sat back and we said, all right, look, he's not going to be working on counting exercises for right now. We're just going to work on sitting in his chair. And in fact, we're really going to take such a big step back that if his butt cheeks hit the chair, we're going to deliver a highly preferred thing as a consequence for that. We're going to reinforce the heck out of that. And over time, got to the point where he initially was able to sit for more than a second or two, and then up to a minute or two, and then introducing a little bit of actual counting exercises, but a tiny little bit. And we went to the teacher and said, look, he's sitting in his chair for 5 minutes at a time, and he's getting started on some of this initial counting stuff. And she was completely underwhelmed, right? She's like, well, he's supposed to be doing whole worksheet at a time. And my point was, all right, look, we're going to put some of that on hold while we work specifically on this set of skills. And the reality was, 5 good minutes was better than anything that was happening prior to that. But that did mean that we had to put the expectations on hold around what he was doing academically so that we could get that type of behavior under better control. And so that oftentimes means actual practice, thinking ahead and being systematic about how one can actually address those types of behaviors within those situations, as opposed to just kind of hoping that everything's going to be okay. So giving families homework about when and where to practice some of those skills. And that includes things like planning ahead, being systematic about it, being prepared to leave a situation suddenly. If you're out in the store and you're trying to teach the individual to stay with you, you got to be prepared that you're going to leave if things get real bad, or if things are going really good, even. You want to end on a good note. So there's a lot that goes into how those practice sessions can be structured. And then the last thing is to use signals or cues in the environment to teach the individual when things are accessible and when they might not be okay. So for example, even once you've taught the young man I was describing before about how to request an iPad, he gained that skill to ask for the iPad, but now he's just asking for the iPad all the time. And there are those times where we really need to have him put the iPad away and work on learning some skills, or even do something else in his environment, go take a shower, which is hard to do with an iPad. And so using signals or cues is a helpful way to do that. The way we oftentimes do that is to use cues that signal when something is available and when they're not. There's nothing magical about the specific stimuli that they use. We'll use things like a green go sign and a red stop sign, or a green bracelet and a red bracelet. And then we figured out, well, a lot of the folks we work with are more likely to be colorblind, and so we've switched to other colors. I'm going to stick with red and green right here because it's a little bit more familiar. Red means no, green means yes. And so initially what we would do is set up, and whenever the green wristband is on, that means if you ask for the iPad, you get the iPad. And whenever the red wristband is on, if you ask for the iPad, you're not going to get the iPad. You'll get, not right now, but it's coming, buddy. Just hang on for a second. And initially the schedule is tilted really heavily towards green. That might mean for every 5 minutes, 4 minutes and 50 seconds or 55 seconds is green and 5 seconds is red. Really trying to set it up so that the red is so brief that there's really no time or opportunity to see the safety compromising behavior. But then over time, and as the individual starts to only make the request, or only engage in the behavior, only make that type of request in the presence of the green card or the green wristband, and never in the presence of the red, we start to tilt the balance. So over time, going from 5 seconds of red to 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. In the case of this young man, we got to 45 minutes, where he could tolerate 45 minutes of the red wristband for 5. In contrast, he would only have 5 minutes of green when he would have access. And he would tolerate that okay, because he had learned, look, it's coming. I'm going to get access. It's not gone forever. And it's something that he over time was able to tolerate longer and longer periods. All right, I want to talk about the mitigation set of strategies. Again, these are those that are going to decrease the effect of the behavior, but not necessarily whether or not they happen. And these are really good, again, for trying to ensure quality of life while interventions are being put in place. The best example of this that I can think of is some work that we've done with the emergency department in the hospital that we're part of, where there were nurses who were getting injured, and they were really coming to us saying, we see individuals on the autism spectrum in the ED, they're coming in crisis, we don't know how to work with them. And the thing that we provided them with a lot of training. We taught them a little bit about autism in general. We taught them some strategies for identifying function. But what they came back to us with was the thing that made the biggest difference was some protective equipment. Things like these sleeves that you can see here. You can see in that picture with the arm, that's me modeling those there, right? Yeah, sure, I look like that. I'm an arm model, but something they could wear under a long sleeve shirt that would allow them to work with an individual who might occasionally be aggressive or bite, knowing that if they were bitten or if they were hit, it wasn't going to cause a big injury. And that gave them the confidence to be around that individual and feel safe. It wasn't super obtrusive. It wasn't super stigmatizing, but it allowed them to maybe not approach that individual from a posture of anxiety. And I think a lot of the individuals that they were working with could sense when there was someone around them who was anxious, and that led them to be anxious, and then actually made the situation worse in the first place. So these are examples of how one can go about trying to mitigate the behavior, knowing that, look, aggression might occur in this case. This is more about making sure if it does, that nobody's getting injured. So these are an important set of strategies that are important to include. And again, not enough time to go into that in a ton of detail. But lastly, I just want to say crisis management is another really important part. The truth is, crisis management strategies generally mean doing whatever is necessary to make a bad situation safe. It's definitely the case that one of the ways to do that is to reinforce the problem behavior or the safety compromising behavior, right? And that can mean in the short term, things get worse instead of better. And a lot of people in my field will say you should never, ever do that. Never, ever give in or give the individual what they want because of safety compromising behavior, because it reinforces that behavior and it makes it more likely to occur in the future. And I'm here to tell you that's just not realistic, that there are very real world situations that occur when things are real, real dangerous, and you got to do whatever you need to do to make the situation safe. I think that the issue that I see though is that concerns me is when a crisis occurs and then it occurs again and it occurs again and nobody's done anything about it. I've gone into a classroom before and I've heard people say like, "Oh no, Johnny's in a crisis again. Let's go to crisis mode and give him what he wants to calm him down." And the crisis is occurring every couple of days and they're not doing anything different as a result of that. So our policy is you get to call it a crisis once, and then you know that it's in that individual's recipe or in their toolbox and that this is something they're capable of. And you got to have a plan so that the next time that occurs, we can work through that without necessarily having to call it a crisis and give in and give them the wrong thing. The other thing that I think is really important to crisis management strategies, it's important to think ahead. This is something that you have to really be prepared for. The best example of that I can think of is the work that my team has done around elopement. Again, super dangerous behavior when individuals go missing. And then when a situation has arisen where someone has eloped, it's too late at that point to really do a lot of the crisis planning that is otherwise necessary. So here's an example of some of the materials and ideas that we provide families who are dealing with who live with or love an individual who elopes, and what they need to be doing in order to make that situation safe and be able to respond in a crisis should it occur. Things like talk to your neighbors. Tell them, look, if my child is walking down the street alone, they shouldn't be out there. And at this day and age, people get really nervous about stopping or interacting with other people's kids. And so they really want to hold off on that. But you're telling them, look, if you see my kid, stop them, please. Call me. Here's my number. Are you okay with joining a search party if my child goes missing? Look at the lay of the land around where you live and identify those really dangerous spots. That's where you're going to search first. Practice calling first responders so you understand who's going to pick up the phone if I call with a missing loved one. Who's going to pick up the phone? What information are they going to provide me? How do I keep that information handy? How do I really make sure that this is as expeditious as possible? So that's an example for elopement, but regardless of the topography, some form of crisis management plan is really important and it needs to be developed and updated and kept current so that when things hit the fan, the situation can be made safe as possible. All right, I know I'm just about out of time. I want to conclude a little bit by saying safety compromising behavior, it's a really big deal, and it needs to have an individualized approach, and that approach needs to be based on the function. The best approach is going to include all 4 types of strategies: prevention strategies, intervention strategies, mitigation, and crisis management. The truth is, how much each of these is emphasized is going to vary by individual and circumstances and setting. And so some places you're going to find, look, we're relying real heavily on those mitigation and prevention strategies while we're just not able to do as much around intervention. Other places, like, look, we can do all the intervention we need. We're doing great. We don't ever have to use prevention, and we want to have a crisis management strategy just in case, but we hope to never use it. So it really can vary depending on the needs of the individual, but I would articulate or argue that all 4 should at least be contemplated and have some version of these, and then find that balance and working with providers and making sure that they're including all of these in the plan for that individual. And with that, I'm going to end there and know that there is a little bit of time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so
I
much,
talked
Dr.
fast. Sorry about that.
No, that was a lot of information in a good amount of time. So thank you so much. And we do have quite a few questions. And thanks to everyone that's been so active, kind of helping fill in questions with each other as well. But one theme that's come up a few times is with reference to technology like iPads and iPhones. In many cases, the use of these can become an addiction, especially for adults. And so a lot of people are, specifically some autistic adults and practitioners as well, are wondering if it's really beneficial to remove, for example, an iPad or a computer or phone, if that is a sensory, a calming technique for a child or a person, or is kind of an addiction almost for our nervous systems. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, just like anything, there's a question of what is this question of, is this a coping strategy, or is this something that is I wouldn't typically use the term addiction in this case, but I think in this case addiction just means overuse, right, or over reliance on something. And my question is whether or not something is causing harm. And I think we need to be really thoughtful about that. There's absolutely a history of people producing or providing interventions for a behavior that is not really harmful, right? And there's a history in the literature on, like, stereotypy, for example, individuals who might engage in some kind of stereotypic behavior, repetitive behavior that is very much self-soothing, isn't hurting anybody, and it certainly isn't hurting them. And that history, I think, was, maybe there were good intentions, I don't know, but certainly I think we have become much better about recognizing that in many instances these types of behaviors are a coping strategy or a soothing strategy. And we wouldn't want to necessarily disrupt that. That would be something that would be counterproductive, right? I mean, this is something that if the individual needs that in order to get through their day, and they're not hurting anyone, they're not hurting themselves, and it's just helping them to cope, I would argue that is absolutely not something that requires any kind of intervention. I'm more so referring to the young man, like I said, who is only interested in the iPads to such a degree that he's not learning any way to communicate. He's not able to work on learning any skills, not able to go to school, not able to get in the car, receive medical care, right? Like those kinds of instances where that singular focus on the iPad has become so much a disruption, or is actually really degrading their quality of life. And then the last thing I'll say about that, and I think maybe some of the people who are asking questions about this would maybe agree with me, is it's also really important to think through whose quality of life is being improved by some of these interventions, right? There's a real big difference between making someone else's life more convenient and improving the quality of life of the individual. And it's also important to understand what the priorities and what's important to that individual, right? Because having access to an iPad is something that people are allowed to have, and saying, well, I know better what's best for you than you know what's best for you, is a really slippery slope. And I think it's something we have to be super thoughtful about and be very conscientious about assessing what does this individual want for them and for their life. For a lot of the folks that I work with, they don't communicate through spoken communication, or in some cases they lack any way to communicate at all, in a way other than safety compromising behavior, and safety compromising behavior is the way that they're communicating. And so in those instances, trying to replace that safety compromising behavior with an alternative means of communication that is less harmful to them and to those around them, and is going to open up opportunities to be more engaged with their community, to be more engaged with the people around them, or really just, if that's what they care about, or in some cases, just be able to access the things that they do care about more effectively and more consistently. Like, those are all things that I think are really, really important. And I know I didn't get into that here today. My focus was more on the how than the why and the what. But those are big, big questions that are absolutely important to be thinking about. And I think there's a lot of growth that the field has undergone in the last handful of years. There's still a long way to go. But it is something that I think is really important to point out. And I'm glad that the questioners raised that issue.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a very in-depth response. I think that answered it very well. I know that it's difficult to address specific instances, but quite a few people have asked if there's kind of a general suggestion of what to do if you've entered this crisis mode, specifically where someone is doing self-injurious behavior, maybe biting their lip really hard, or like the photo you showed earlier. Because you don't want to give in to this behavior, but you don't want this person to also harm themselves.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of catch-22 almost. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to minimize the complexity or minimize how hard this can be to try to find the right set of circumstances. And I want to be also very transparent that I certainly have run into situations where, you're looking for the Venn diagram of what's possible and what's going to make a difference. And in just being completely transparent, like, there are situations that I come across with some regularity where there's no overlap in that Venn diagram. They are two completely separate circles and they don't even touch, right? And that's a reality. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm trying to just sit here and say, like, oh, well, just go do this thing that, you don't have access to help, or you don't have a BCBA who knows what they're doing when it comes to this stuff, or you don't have a facility that does this type of work. The center where I work right now, we see kids with the most difficult and destructive types of safety compromising behavior that are really out there. And we get kids from around the country, and we have, the worst part of my job is to say, look, number one, yes, we believe you, because a lot of these families don't get told that very often, right? Yes, we believe you that this is exactly what's going on. And not only that, I have a whole team of people who have dedicated their whole careers to helping families like yours, but we have an 18-month waiting list, and that feels crappy. And it's something that is a reality, and it's something that my team and I are very focused on thinking through and trying everything we can come up with through advocacy and program development to try to expand access to those kinds of services. Because the reality is there's way more families who need those kinds of supports than are available in this country or really any other, in my experience. And I travel the world talking to folks, and nobody really has this set. There's different challenges based on where you live, but nobody's doing this really well. So I think to go back to the question of, well, what do you do for those families where they're trying to find that middle ground of there's a crisis and then there's what we don't want to give in? At the end of the day, I think there is no doubt that you just can't allow the individual to really harm themselves, right? Like if you have to compromise on one of those two, it's got to be you err on the side of no harm, even if that means giving in, right? Because you want to, I don't know, like it's the wrong, I can't think of a better term, like live to fight another day, right? And I don't want to use that term because in some cases this can be life or death, right? Like that's really it. Um, and so making it through to another day and hoping that you can find additional resources. If you can only do one of those two things, that's where I would say err on the side of maintaining safety above all else. Um, but understanding that that does mean that this perpetuates that behavior and in some cases could be making things worse. But I don't have a better thing to tell you than at the end of the day, everybody needs to be kept safe. It's why I give talks like this. It's why I have a team of folks who are so focused on this, because it's really hard to see and hear families and what they're living with and the help that they're not getting. And there's just so much need right now in this area. And increasingly, there are more and more people who know how to do this type of work, but there's nowhere near enough.
Thank you for this very human-centered response. No, there's a lot of different, very specific things going on in people's lives. So if we want to, I'm going to pivot a little bit to an adult perspective here. An adult long-term care. There are limitations being taken away, but to kind of help with safety, was it SCBs? But a lot of the times they can't find a specific function for this behavior. And so what happens is then, as you kind of discussing, things are taken away or the space becomes a little bit, more observed. They need supervision to promote safety, but in often cases, this supervision or this retraction of things leads to more SCBs. And so without kind of knowing what the function is, do you have any advice on what to focus on? Set of restrictions, maybe?
So sometimes it's really difficult. I will fully confess that I have oversimplified, the process for identifying function, and it is not as clean as those graphs that I made it look in many, many instances. It's not as simple as I've made it out to be. And that's partly just because time doesn't allow for all the nuance that goes into this type of work, right? One that I talked about very little, though, is that automatically maintained behavior, right? This is the behavior that is just kind of occurring for its own sake. There's a pattern that you can look for in data that are being collected or observations that are being conducted to identify whether or not behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. And again, this is behavior that's occurring for its own sake, which means that there are fewer strategies, right? There are fewer things you can do to teach a replacement behavior because that is the reward that's maintaining that behavior, right? And so in instances where there is no clear function, one of the things to look for is it actually automatic, right? Is this behavior just kind of maintaining itself? The other thing I would say is in some cases, even if it's not, but you can't figure out the function, you kind of have to treat it like it's automatic, whether it is or not, right? Because what that means when you say it's automatic is that other people don't have control over whatever is being produced by this behavior, right? That whether it's because it's producing some form of sensory stimulation or it's producing some other consequence in the environment. Like, I've seen individuals who throw toys because they really love noises. Or another example, right? Here's probably the best example I can think of for this specific question. I have worked with a young man who really, really liked flashing lights. Flashing lights, big commotion, loud noises. That was his favorite thing in the world. And he had learned that a really effective way to make that happen was to throw rocks at cop cars. And he could make cop cars flip their lights on pretty easily. And so, is that social? Yes, but I don't control all the cops in this town. So I can't really control whether or not the flashing lights come on or not, right? I don't have control over that. So I kind of have to treat it as though it's automatic regardless. And there are strategies you can use in those cases. They're a little bit less effective. They're a little bit more generic, and they tend to take more time and be not quite as effective. But oftentimes what you're trying to do is to find other things that will compete with whatever that is. So if flashing lights, I don't have control over flashing lights, is there something else in this kid's world that is more preferred than flashing lights? Or I can provide him with flashing lights that are easier to access than throwing rocks at cop cars? Or is there a way and teach him to request that and find ways to teach him to delay? Like, it's really kind of using those other strategies to try to figure out how to attenuate that type of behavior. They're harder, they require a little bit more precision, they require a little bit more support, but there are strategies like that that exist. I know
Thank
we're
you.
at time, and I know we only got to a couple questions, but I hope this was helpful.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of the main themes. If you've got time for one more question,
Sure.
I'll pitch this one to you, specifically about elopement.
Mhm.
Have an attendee, sorry, I just lost the question. Saying it can actually be a good coping strategy in some cases. Sometimes what needs to happen is for someone to exit a situation or a room.
Sure.
So yeah, that's kind of making that comment if you have something to say.
Yeah, so I think maybe what I should have specified is when I talk about elopement, and again, the definition being leaving supervision without permission, I think the intent was to say for individuals who require supervision, right? If someone needs supervision to be safe and then they're leaving that supervision, I would consider that to be elopement. Someone who's perfectly safe leaving a space, without being supervised, I wouldn't consider that to be elopement in the first place.
Right. Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
And
No, it's a
thank
good
you.
question. I appreciate that's good feedback. I hadn't thought about how that might be heard without that additional clause in the definition.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Call. This was a great webinar. We've
Yes.
had a lot. Thank you everyone for sending in your questions. We had almost 50 comments and questions from you guys. So this webinar was recorded. So playback will be available later today at autism.org/webinars and also on our YouTube channel. Thank you all again so much. Thank you, Dr. Call, for your time and your expertise. And we will see you guys all again soon.